Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, January 9th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism against people in foreign countries, which our government's defenders offer as a lying excuse for those wars. The real reason for them is the profits of the U.S. economic elite, the 1%. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. overseas bases, most of them ringing Russia and China. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The crimes of the U.S. government are not much known in the U.S., but they aren't new. Since at least the end of the 19th century, the U.S. has been determined to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia under any power, Eastern or Western, for fear that it would hinder the economic exploitation of the world by the American 1%. That's what that unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, stopping their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That's why the U.S. left Russia to defeat Hitler alone in 1941, so that the U.S. could concentrate on Japan. In World War II as a whole, the U.S. had 500,000 casualties, but Russia lost perhaps 27 million people in defeating Nazi Germany. The bedrock of U.S. foreign policy today remains the containment of Eurasia, Russia and China, and retarding its economic development. The American task is more difficult today at any time since World War II, owing to the effective alliance between Russia and China and their alliance with other states, notably Iran and Syria. That's why the U.S. has 1,000, yes, 1,000, military bases around Russia and China, while Russia has 15 bases outside its country, and China has 1. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country on either side. After the war, the U.S. State Department noted that we had 50% of the world's wealth, but only about 6% of the world's population. They wrote, quote, "This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction," close quote. Our immediate national objectives in the U.S. since World War II have been economic control of the world. For most of my life, that was presented as a struggle with Russian communism. But we weren't told that the communist bloc never controlled an economy more than half the size of that of the U.S. From World War II up to today, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain their economic control of the world. President Obama was the first U.S. president in history to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. In the campaign, President Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting, Obama's war provocations against Russia and China, and Obama's drone assassinations, accurately called the greatest terrorist program in modern times. But once in office, Trump has adopted Obama's war policies. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was formed at the time of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, which began America's longest war. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but in fact it's killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. has been at war almost continuously since World War II, putting down challenges to its economic control of the world. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph for the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia, China, and Iran. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, stop the drone attacks, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3, cut military spending by at least 50%, and close the 1,000 U.S. overseas military bases. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the world's countries. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update U.S. nuclear weapons. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which of course represent the views of the American political establishment and are in the business of manufacturing consent to those views. Tonight, we'll try to give a better account. And our first story comes from the source of much of our research, Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, on Democracy Now! As part of the problem. Glenn Greenwald, the reporter now associated with the group The Intercept, spoke on Democracy Now! This last week, and this is what he said. What you see now is large parts of the media, MSNBC and lots of liberal websites, growing exponentially by constantly not talking about Trump's dangerous foreign policy or his rollback of regulations or his ignoring of climate, the things that actually matter, but this obsession on the Russia scandal. And they're getting great benefits from it. And so that's what happens is we have this balkanized media that feeds the audiences whatever it is they want to hear without any journalistic standards. And so the incentive is to constantly inflate and exaggerate and make it as sensationalistic as possible. And people are eating it up to the profit of those media outlets, close quote. Jeff Nicholson writes, as I've pointed out before, Democracy Now! Does this. I don't know if Democracy Now! Gets great benefits from it. Democracy Now! Still seems as small time and ignored by others now as it has been in the past. But DN's telling part of the story via contextless headlines, letting guests say things like the above while never having DN's hosts say the same, is how DN plays their game. This was vastly different during the run-up to the invasion of Iraq under G.W. Bush. Then, when Democracy Now! Would report the lies the New York Times put on its front page about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, Democracy Now! Added information from Hans Blix's group, saying they went to Iraq and found no such evidence. I still strongly suspect that this is part of a lucrative strategy on DN's part. DN's host silence allows them to tell Democratic Party donors to give to Democracy Now! Generously and pledge to never carry news that make the Democrats look too bad. DN can afford to rarely feature guests like Greenwald saying the above, and DN can point to these guests saying something like, "Look, we got the counter story out." Just like the news comedy shows saying something once, John Oliver on the drone war, which barely mentioned how Obama is chiefly responsible for that, counts as much as repeating a line, "Drumpf," on John Oliver's show, for instance. Everyone knows that repetition is how we learn, and repetition sticks with the audience. So a one-off becomes a lame excuse one can point to if needed. I don't go for that false equivalence of a one-off being the same as repetition, and neither should anyone else. By the way, Democracy Now! Never carried any news about the DLC lawsuit, the lawsuit against the Democratic National Committee on their election tilting to Clinton. And no, I will not ever stop citing that as a huge point of shame for Democracy Now!, because that story highlights the abject corruption of the Democratic Party and strongly incentivizes Democrats to reconsider their allegiance to that party. And years from now, I will also give DN no credit for carrying what will have become old news about that lawsuit and the revealing statements from the Democratic Committee's lawyer. Doing the right thing when it counts is what matters in the news trade, and Democracy Now! Is simply too partisan and liberal, in the worst sense of that term, for me to trust I'm getting the straight dope from them. I'm afraid Jeff's right about this, and the Democracy Now!, which we have, of course, often praised here at News from Neptune, has been showing for a good while a regrettable influence to do exactly what Jeff suggests. We should be unhappy about that, and perhaps even make representations to Democracy Now! You're watching News from Neptune. No, you're not. You're watching Aware on the Air. Hey, it's a new year. We're trying to get it together here. Aware on the Air, I think I may even have made that mistake a moment ago. Aware on the Air is presented by the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. It is usually a panel discussion. Recently, I've had the honor of being able to constitute the entire panel, but we're very happy to have other members of Aware and friends of Aware join us here to talk about the war news that you don't hear in the regular media. If you want to consider, know something about that war news in America these days, consider how the New York Times began its first piece on for the year under the title 7 Wishes for 2018. Quote, "Well, at least it's not 2017 anymore. I expect that future historians will look back on it as one of the darker, non-war years in the country's history," close quote. That's David Leonard, a columnist for the New York Times, welcoming the new year. Think about it for a moment. 2017, a non-war year? Tell that to the Afghans, the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Yemenis, the Somalis, or for that matter, the parents of the 4 American Green Berets who died in Niger last October. Still, let's admit it, the New York Times caught a deeper American reality of 2017, not to speak of the years before that, and undoubtedly this one, too. We don't know about the war. Launched in October 2001, what was once called the Global War on Terror has never ended. Instead, it's morphed and spread over large parts of the planet. In all the intervening years, the United States has been in a state of permanent war that shows no sign of concluding in 2018. Its planes continue to drop a staggering tonnage of munitions. Its drones continue to hellfire missile country after country. And in recent years, the elite Special Operation Forces, now a military within the U.S. military of about 70,000 personnel, have been deployed to almost every imaginable country on the planet. They train allied militaries and proxy forces, advise and sometimes fight with those forces in the field, conduct raids, and engage in what certainly looks like war. The only catch in all this is the American people. Long divorced from their all-volunteer military in a draftless country, we've largely ignored the war on terror and gone about our business just as President George W. Bush urged us to do 2 weeks after the 9/11 attacks. He said, quote, "Get down to Disney World in Florida. Take your families and enjoy life the way we want it to be enjoyed," close quote. That was President Bush after the 9/11 attacks. As those distant conflicts expanded and terror groups spread and multiplied, Washington helped the non-war atmosphere along by perfecting a new kind of warfare in which ever fewer Americans would die. Half a century later, its quagmire qualities aside, the war on terror is largely the anti-Vietnam War. No body counts, few body bags, lots of proxy forces, armed robotic vehicles in the skies, and at the tip of the spear, a vast, ever more secretive military, those special ops guys. As a result, if you weren't in that all-volunteer military or a family member of someone who was, it wasn't too hard to live as if the country's forever wars had nothing to do with us. It's possible that never in our history, one filled with wars, have Americans been more deeply demobilized from war, than in the current era. When it comes to the war on terror, there's neither been a wave of support nor, since 2003, a wave of protest. The demonstrations against the war in 2003 were quite massive, but the genius of American politics in the last 15 years is to neutralize that protest. In a sense, then, the New York Times was right on the mark. In so much of the world, 2017 was a grim year of war, displacement, and disaster. Here, however, it was, in so many ways, just another non-war year. In that context, we recommend the article from Nick Terse that I will put on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. That's the Facebook page for the Aware of Champaign-Urbana. Terse's article is about America's special operations. At about 11 o'clock, at around 11 o'clock that night, 4 Lockheed MC-130 combat Talons, turboprop special operations aircraft, were flying through a moonless sky from Pakistani into Afghan airspace. On board were 199 Army Rangers with orders to seize an airstrip. 100 miles to the northeast, Chinook and Black Hawk helicopters cruised through the darkness towards Kandahar, carrying Army Delta Force operators and yet more Rangers heading for a second site. It was October 19th, 2001. The war in Afghanistan had just begun, and U.S. Special Operation Forces, SOF as they're called, were the tip of the American spear. Those Rangers parachuted into and then swarmed the airfield, engaging the enemy, a single armed fighter, as it turned out, and killing him. At that second site, the residence of Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar, the special operators apparently encountered no resistance at all, even though several Americans were wounded due to friendly fire and a helicopter crash. In 2001, U.S. special operators were targeting just 2 enemy forces, al-Qaeda and the Taliban. In 2010, his first full year in office, President Barack Obama informed Congress that U.S. forces were still, quote, actively pursuing and engaging remaining al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters in Afghanistan, close quote. According to a recent Pentagon report to Congress, American troops are battling more than 10 times that number of militant groups, including the still undefeated Taliban, the Haqqani Network, an Islamic State affiliate known as ISIS-Khorasan, and the various other insurgent networks, as the Pentagon says. After more than 16 years of combat, U.S. Special Operation Forces remain the tip of the spear in Afghanistan, where they continue to carry out counterterrorism missions. In fact, from June 1st to November 24th last year, According to that Pentagon report, members of Special Operations Joint Task Force Afghanistan conducted 2,175 ground operations, quote, in which they enabled or advised Afghan commandos, i.e. battles. During the Obama administration, the use of Special Operation Forces increased dramatically, as if their use was a sort of magical, all-purpose solution for fighting terrorism. The ensuing years have proven this assumption to be false. There are many impressive, highly skilled personnel involved in special operations on behalf of the United States, but the problems they are being asked to solve often do not have military solutions. Despite this fact, the Trump administration is doubling down on this approach in Afghanistan, even though the strategy has not prevented the spread of terrorist organizations and may in fact be counterproductive, close quote. Counterproductive is a Pentagon phrase for getting the opposite result that you set out to do. We may ask whether the U.S. wants to produce terrorism or end it. Given U.S. commandos went to war in 2001, the size of Special Operations Command has doubled from about 33,000 personnel to 70,000 today. As their numbers have grown, so has their global reach. They were deployed to 149 nations in 2017, or about 75% of the countries on the planet, a record-setting year. It topped 2016's 138 nations under the Obama administration and dwarfed the numbers from the final years of the Bush administration. As the scope of deployments has expanded, special operators also came to be spread ever more equally across the planet. In October 2001, Afghanistan was the sole focus of commando combat missions. On March 19, 2003, special operators fired the first shots in the invasion of Iraq as their helicopter teams attacked Iraqi border posts near Jordan and Saudi Arabia. By 2006, as the war in Afghanistan ground on and the conflict in Iraq continued to morph into a raging set of insurgencies, 85% of U.S. commandos were being deployed to the greater Middle East. As this decade dawned in 2010, the numbers hadn't changed appreciably. 81% of all special operators abroad, special operators being these elite American military forces, were still in that region. 8 years later, however, the situation is markedly different, according to figures provided by the U.S. Special Operations Command. Despite claims that the Islamic State has been defeated, the U.S. remains embroiled in wars in Iraq and Syria, as well as in Afghanistan and Yemen, yet only 54% of special operators deployed overseas were sent to the greater Middle East in 2017. In fact, since 2006, deployments have been on the rise across the rest of the world. In Latin America, the figure crept up from 3% to 5%. In the Pacific region, from 7% to 8%. The striking increases have been in Europe and Africa. In 2006, just 3% of all U.S. commandos deployed overseas were operating in Europe. Last year, that number was above 16%. Outside of Russia and Belarus, we train with virtually every country in Europe, either bilaterally or through various multinational events, a spokesman for the U.S. Special Operations Command Europe said. The persistent presence of U.S. Special Operation Forces alongside our allies sends a clear message of U.S. commitment to our allies and the defense of our NATO alliance. Close quote. That's the Army's expression of what they're doing. For the past 2 years, in fact, the U.S. has maintained a special operations contingent in almost every nation on Russia's western border. As Special Operations Command Chief General Raymond Thomas put it last year, quote, "We've had persistent presence in every country, every NATO country, and others on the border with Russia, doing phenomenal things with our allies, helping them prepare for their threats," close quote. Africa, however, has seen the most significant increase in special ops deployments. In 2006, the figure for that continent was just 1%. As 2017 ended, it stood at 17%. In other words, more commandos are operating there than in any region except the Middle East. Special Operations Forces were active in at least 33 nations in Africa last year. The situation in one of those nations, Somalia, in many ways mirrors in microcosm the 16-plus years of U.S. operations in Afghanistan. Not long after the 9/11 attacks, a senior Pentagon official suggested that the Afghan invasion might drive militants out of that country and into African nations. Quote, terrorists associated with al-Qaeda and indigenous terrorist groups have been and continue to be a presence in this region, Africa, he said. These terrorists will, of course, threaten U.S. personnel and facilities, close quote. When pressed about actual transnational dangers, that official pointed to Somali militants, only to eventually admit that even the most extreme Islamists there, quote, really have not engaged in acts of terrorism outside Somalia. Similarly, when questions about connections between Osama bin Laden's core al-Qaeda group and African extremists, he offered only the most tenuous links, like bin Laden's salute to Somali militants who killed U.S. troops during the infamous 1993 Black Hawk Down incident. Nonetheless, U.S. commandos reportedly began operating in Somalia in 2001. Air attacks by AC-130 gunships followed in 2007, and 2011 saw the beginning of U.S. drone strikes aimed at militants from Al-Shabaab, a terror group that didn't even exist in 2006. According to figures combined by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, one of the few good sources of information on these things, the U.S. carried out between 32 and 36 drone strikes and was 9 to 13 ground attacks in Somalia between 2001 and 2016. You may remember that the U.S. Constitution says the U.S. government cannot carry on war without the authorization of Congress. There was, of course, no authorization of Congress for war in Africa. Last spring, President Donald Trump loosened Obama-era restrictions on offensive operations in Somalia, allowing U.S. forces more discretion in conducting missions there. He opened up the possibility of more frequent airstrikes and commando raids. The 2017 numbers reflect just that. The U.S. carried out 34 drone strikes, at least equaling, if not exceeding, the cumulative number of attacks over the previous 15 years. And it took the United States only a day to resume such strikes this past year. Quote, President Trump's decision to make parts of southern Somalia an area of active hostilities gave U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, the designation of the U.S. command structure for its military in Africa, the leeway to carry out strikes at an increased rate because it no longer had to run their proposed operations through the White House national security bureaucratic process. Said Jack Searle, an expert on U.S. counterterrorism operations in Somalia. He was quick to point out that AFRICOM claims the uptick in operations is due to more targets presenting themselves, but he suspects that AFRICOM may be attempting to cripple al-Shabaab before an African Union peacekeeping force is withdrawn and Somalia's untested military is left to fight the militants without thousands of additional African troops. In addition to the 30-plus airstrikes in 2017, there were at least 3 U.S. ground attacks in Somalia. In one of the latter, described by AFRICOM as, quote, an advise and assist operation alongside members of the Somali National Army, close quote, Navy SEAL Kyle Milliken was killed, and 2 U.S. personnel were injured during a firefight with al-Shabaab militants. In another ground operation in August, according to investigation by the Daily Beast, Special Operations Forces took part in a massacre of 10 Somali civilians. As in Afghanistan, the U.S. has been militarily engaged in Somalia since 2001, and as in Afghanistan, despite more than a decade and a half of operations, the number of militant groups being targeted has only increased. U.S. commandos are now battling at least 2 terror groups, Al-Shabaab and a local Islamic State affiliate. As drone strikes spiked in the last year, and Somalia became an ever hotter war zone. Today, according to AFRICOM, militants operate training camps and possess safe havens throughout Somalia and the region. The underreported 16-year U.S. intervention in Somalia has followed a similar pattern to the larger U.S. war in Afghanistan. An influx of special forces and a steady increase in airstrikes has not only failed to stop terrorism, but both al-Shabaab and a local affiliate of ISIS have grown during this time period. It's another case of failing to learn the lessons of the United States policy of endless war, that military action is as likely or more likely to spark terrorist action as to reduce or prevent it. Somalia is no anomaly. Across the continent, despite escalating operations by commandos as well as conventional American forces and their local allies and proxies, Washington enemies continue to proliferate. A 2012 Special Operations Command strategic planning document listed 5 prime terror groups on the continent. An October 2016 update counted 7. The Islamic State, Ansar al-Sharia, al-Qaeda in the lands of the Islamic Maghreb, al-Murabitum, Boko Haram, the Lord's Resistance Army, and al-Shabaab, in addition to, quote, other violent extremist organizations. What's producing all this? Perhaps the United States campaign? The Pentagon's Africa Center for Strategic Study now offers a tally of 21 active militant Islamic groups on the continent. In fact, the full number of terrorist organizations may already have been closer to 50 by 2015. As wars and interventions have multiplied, as U.S. commandos have spread across the planet, and as terror groups have proliferated, the tempo of operations have jumped dramatically. This, in turn, has raised fear among think tank experts, special ops supporters, and members of Congress about the effects on those elite troops of such constant deployments and growing pressure for more of them. Some, quote, most SOF units, Special Operations Forces, are employed to their sustainable limit, General Thomas told members of Congress last spring. Despite growing demand for Special Operation Forces, we must prioritize the sourcing of these demands as we face a rapidly changing security environment. Yet the number of countries with Special Operations deployments hit a new record last year. The accounts of U.S. Special Operations in Africa and elsewhere, the terrorism that produces terrorism in response, are not mentioned in the American media. This article that I've been quoting from the reporter Nick Turse can be found on our Facebook page for Aware and elsewhere in the literature, in the news, if you look for it. It's important that Americans realize what in fact we're doing and how the global war on terror that began with the beginning of this century continues and expands today, even though we're not told about it. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the second week of 2018. Another week in which the world can see the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. We'll conclude tonight with the first of a series from the Real News Network that will be featuring this month. In his groundbreaking new book, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, Norman Finkelstein argues that Israel, with U.S. backing, has caused a humanitarian disaster in Gaza and that international human rights groups have failed to uphold justice for its besieged people. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. See No's notes on our blog, newsfromneptune.com. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And do see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to tonight. And a link, by the way, to Aware's anti-war teach-in on YouTube, prepared by the omnicompetent Jason Liggett, and also Nicholson Baker's excellent article, Why I'm a Pacifist, The Myth of the Good War. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't, Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. No, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, Ed Mendel, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. The Gaza Strip is among the world's most densely populated areas. And for more than 50 years of Israeli occupation, it's also been one of the world's most continuously tormented. For more than a decade, Israel has imposed a crippling blockade and launched multiple military attacks, including 2 ground invasions. In these years, thousands of Palestinians have died and tens of thousands have lost their homes. More than 70% of Gaza's residents are refugees, or the children of refugees, and more than half are children. Just last year, the UN warned that Gaza's situation is so dire that it may be unlivable in the next few years. 95% of Gaza's water is unfit for human consumption. Now, one conventional way to explain all this is that Gaza's residents are caught in a crossfire between an Israeli government that sometimes goes too far and a ruling Hamas faction that rejects Israel's existence and terrorizes Israelis with rocket fire. Well, a new book challenges this narrative, and it argues that what has befallen Gaza is a human-made humanitarian disaster by Israel and Israel only, along with the backing of the U.S. and the complicity of many others. That complicity includes not just governments, but also international human rights groups. The book is called Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom by Norman Finkelstein, author of many books on Israel-Palestine and one of the world's leading scholars on the topic. Norman is here in the Real News studio for his first interview on the book. Welcome, Norman.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming down and joining us. Let's start with the subtitle. Why an inquest into its martyrdom? What do you mean by that?
Well, it's very popular nowadays to talk about the agency of victims, and that you shouldn't just cast them as victims, but you should also see them as agents. And it is true that within certain limitations, the victims of crimes, they have a certain amount, you could say, of agency. So Nelson Mandela, he manages to preserve his dignity while in Robben's Island. Frederick Douglass manages at one point, one of the famous moments in his slave narrative, to actually engage in a fist fight with his slave owner. I think his name was Covey, C-O-V-E-Y. But the big picture is, if you're a prisoner or a slave, there are real limits to your agency. Your fate is being decided by somebody else. Gaza has been described even by the conservative British Prime Minister David Cameron. He said it's an open-air prison. And when you're a prisoner, you have very little agency. Gaza hasn't been an active agent in its history for the past 50 years. It's been on the receiving end. It's been the recipient of Israeli policy. And in fact, most of the time, what happens in Gaza, these what are called wars, they have very little to do with Gaza.
Okay, before proceeding, it might be useful just to give a little bit of a background sketch. I told a little bit of it in the intro, but just to flesh out a bit more. So, since 1967, Gaza has been occupied by Israel, along with the West Bank. There's a lot of history, but fast forwarding to 2005, Israel disengages from Gaza, pulls out its soldiers and its settlers there. And what now it will say is that it's no longer the occupying power because it withdrew, but instead of getting peace from Gaza, all it's gotten is rocket fire and attacks. So respond to that very widespread narrative.
Right, well, there are 3 aspects. You used the word disengage, which I would say is more neutral than a typical term, which is withdrawal. Israel didn't withdraw from Gaza, and with all due respect to you, it didn't disengage from Gaza. It redeployed. What it did was it removed its troops from the heart of Gaza, along with a relatively small number of settlers, about 6,000 settlers, and then it redeployed on the periphery of Gaza. So the proper analogy, in my opinion, is imagine you have guards in the prison, and then the guards in the prison, they take the keys, throw it to the prisoners get out of the cell, but then the guards, they leave the prison, slam shut the prison gates, and then they redeploy outside the prison. So would you say that they have left the prison? No. The inmates are still confined, they're still incarcerated. They may not be in their cells. So to continue the analogy, yes, for the first time after Israel redeployed from Gaza, Palestinians were able to use the beach. It's true, they had more space, but the essence hasn't changed. And it's important to keep in mind that without exception, every major human rights organization has characterized the situation in Gaza as an occupation after 2006, when Israel completed its redeployment, continued to characterize it as an occupation. And even the quite conservative leading Israeli international law authority, Yoram Dinstein, he said the occupation continues. The claim that the occupation doesn't continue is, it's not even marginal. It doesn't exist among the respected, reputable, and responsible human rights organizations.
Okay, so even if you...
And then there was just the second question as to Hamas, as you call it, the narrative says, continued firing rockets at Israel. It's just not true. What happened was the day after Israel completed its withdrawal, Hamas fired a couple of victory rockets, celebrating the end of the what they call the end of the occupation. Here I'm referring to Hamas. But then after that, all the incidents, virtually all the incidents between Israel and Gaza were initiated by Israel, and it's well documented.
Okay, and you go through this in the book, but let's get into that. You argue that the reason why Israel initiated these multiple flare-ups with Hamas is not actually because Hamas was threatening Israel, but because Hamas was basically being politically pragmatic, coupled with the fact that Israel wanted to showcase for both the Palestinians and its neighbors that it could do what it wanted. It had a strong, quote, deterrence capacity. So explain that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You can't make a generalization about all the Israeli assaults or massacres in Gaza, but you can make some general points acknowledging that there are some deviations from the pattern. So let's take a concrete case. Let's take Operation Cast Lead, which began, I think, December 26th, 2008, and continued till January 17th, 22 days of death and destruction, as Amnesty International called it. Why did Israel attack Gaza? In fact, it had nothing to do with Gaza in the first place. Israel had suffered a major setback in Lebanon in 2006. The Party of God, the Hezbollah, and effectively it's called a tie, but effectively it was a Hezbollah victory. And it was a huge humiliation for Israel, but beyond the humiliation, it was the political side. It diminished Israel's, what it calls, deterrence capacity. And deterrence capacity is just a fancy technical term for the Arab world's fear of Israel. There was now a feeling in the Arab world, well, wait, whoa, Israel can be defeated, and defeated by a relatively small guerrilla army. It's parts of it are well equipped, but in terms of numbers, it's quite small. It was back then, I think it was about 6,000 fighters back then. And most of the fighters, incidentally, that Israel fought were not Hezbollah. They were militias. Hezbollah was saving its best fighters for an Israeli invasion. It never happened. In any event, it was a huge humiliation to Israel, and they were looking for somewhere where they could demonstrate their deterrence capacity, namely to show that it's still the mighty Israel and look out, watch out. They weren't going to tangle with Hezbollah again. They didn't think they were ready for another engagement with Hezbollah. And so they chose Gaza to prove their deterrence capacity or to terrify the Arab world. Now, I want to stress, I'm not speculating. One thing about the Israelis, until after Operation Castlet, Israelis were very straightforward. They didn't hide anything. They were actually quite brazen in how they talked about what they were doing. They kept saying, Gaza is round 2 of the war in Lebanon. We're going to attack Gaza in order to reestablish our deterrence capacity. This has nothing to do with Gaza. I mean, they say it. They're very straightforward about it. And the other concern they had, besides reestablishing the deterrence capacity, there's a nice technical term by an Israeli political scientist who's since passed the scene, Professor Yaniv. I can't remember his last name right now. It'll come to me. In any event, he talked about the Palestinian peace offensives, that the Palestinians are behaving too peacefully, too reasonably, too diplomatically, and then Israel fears that the international pressure will then be exerted on it to settle the conflict finally.
Just to explain, that term comes from the war in Lebanon in '82,
yes,
when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was
the
based
same
in Lebanon.
thing.
And so when the PLO was moderating its stance and moving towards a two-state solution in the late 70s, Israel began, as you've documented, and also was documented in Chomsky's book, The Fateful Triangle.
Oh, yeah.
Israel tried to provoke a PLO attack for close to a year before finally launching the invasion of Lebanon. So that's the background to it, yeah.
Yeah, now his name came back to me, Professor Avner Yaniv, and his book was called Dilemmas of Security. And he said back in, as you said, in 1982, Israel faced a peace offensive. The PLO, under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, was behaving too reasonably. He accepted the two-state settlement of the conflict, and then Israel feared the international reaction to force them to settle.
Right, okay, but now, even if you accept that about the PLO back then, people will look at Hamas and say, well, look, they have a charter that calls for destroying Israel. Hamas has never formally endorsed the two-state solution in the sense that they still say they will not recognize Israel. They have accepted a state within the 67 borders, but that's not actual recognition of Israel. So how has Hamas launched its own version of a quote-unquote peace offensive?
Well, you can make the argument that Hamas hasn't been unequivocal in its stance towards resolution of the conflict, and then you can make the complementary argument that it's been equivocal. But in international politics, it seems to me equivocal is enough to negotiate. If they are equivocating, then you go to the negotiating table and see, well, what are they going to offer? And if they offer nothing, then of course you can make the argument that the equivocation was a fraud, that in fact they never had any intention. But you have to go to the negotiating table first. Israel doesn't want to negotiate, not because it thinks they don't want a two-state settlement. They don't want to go to the negotiating table because they fear that it does want it. If you accept a compromise, but you're not being offered anything, then they say then there are others who are going to say you're a traitor to the movement. So how do you publicly accept a compromise before the other side is making an offer? So, it's politically, if you ask me, of course they should just say we want two states. But I understand that politically it's almost untenable because They know Israel will say no, and then there will be other factions who will say you betrayed the cause because you made a compromise before the other side was willing itself to compromise. So it's politically, I think, it's a difficult situation, though personally, I wish they would drop the equivocation because it makes it much easier for us to argue, meaning people in the West.
Sure, and by the way, it doesn't help that Israel has never said we will recognize a Palestinian state in all the occupied territories.
They never will.
Yeah,
well, that's the whole point, and
yeah.
that's why they're accused. If they were to come out for a compromise, then they'll be accused of being traitors. I should add, there is the unfortunate legacy, namely the Palestinian, the PLO, and then the Palestinian Authority. They did accept two states, and they got nothing for it. So then Hamas thinks, why should we do the same thing and get nothing for it?
They accepted two states, and then they got roped into taking part in further undermining whatever remote prospects are. But that's another story. But
no, it's actually the same story. That's a very important part of the story.
What about Operation Protective Edge of the summer of 2014? Because there's a similar dynamic there where Hamas enters even more into the political arena.
Yes, there was a unity government formed between the two major factions, one, essentially the Palestinian Authority based in the West Bank, and Hamas based in Gaza. They formed the unity government at the end of April 2014, and this enraged, well, what enraged Prime Minister Netanyahu was not the formation of the government, but the fact that the Europeans and the US refused to break off relations with them, meaning the Palestinian Authority, break off relations with the unity government. So Netanyahu was furious, and this was at the time of the Iran agreement also, and he didn't want that agreement. The US was at that point negotiating, the US and what was called 5+1, the 5 Security Council members in Germany, were negotiating with Iran. So they're negotiating with Iran, negotiating with Hamas now via the unity government. So Netanyahu's in a rage. And then some gifts fell into his lap. The first gift was some rogue Hamas faction kidnapped 3 Israelis in the occupied territories, kids.
Israeli teens,
yeah, teens. I want to be clear about that. I don't want to be accused later of whitewashing. 3 Israeli teenagers, and almost immediately killed them. Netanyahu was aware that they were almost immediately killed, but then he found here was a perfect pretext to provoke Hamas and then get it characterized again as a terrorist organization. So he launched an operation called Operation Brother's Keeper, killed Palestinians, rampaged.
And that's billed as an attempt to find these 3 boys. Yeah, it was
billed as an attempt.
Even though all reports indicate that he actually knew they were dead.
Exactly. It was billed as an attempt to find the kids, but he knew that they were dead, but he was a wonderful pretext. And that then set off a chain reaction, not worth going into the details, but it gradually degenerates and then begins Operation Protective Edge. It's interesting what happens next. It begins with the air assault, indiscriminate rocket attacks, artillery on the civilian population of Gaza. But then there's the question whether Netanyahu is going to launch the ground invasion. Ground invasion is always a problem for Israel because there's no way to stop these quote-unquote rocket attacks except on the ground. So you have to send in troops. But if you send in troops, you have 2 problems. Problem number 1 is if you destroy everything in sight indiscriminately, just flatten the place, there are going to be a lot of civilian deaths, and that's not going to look, then there's going to be a lot of diplomatic pressure. But if you go in and you, so to speak, obey the rules of war, you're going to suffer a lot of military casualties, and then there's going to be a lot of domestic pressure. So Netanyahu doesn't know quite what to do. And then another gift drops in his lap, another apple drops in his lap, the gift. One thing about Israelis, which I don't think everybody understands, everybody grasps, is they're extremely attuned to the US news cycle. And so just as I mentioned earlier, the Obama election, they chose November 4th. On July 17th was the downing of the Malaysian airliner over the Ukraine.
Right.
Now, some people will think, what does the Ukraine have to do with Gaza? But in fact, it had everything to do with Gaza, because Netanyahu now knew all the cameras would be riveted on the Ukrainian airliner that was,
and the reason is
the Malaysian airliner that was.
And the reason for that is because it was widely believed that the people who shot down the airliner were Russian-backed rebels, which means we could blame this on Russia, and it could become a big thing, as it was that summer. It was a huge issue.
Right, and exactly at that moment, the same night, the night of the same day, the airliner was down in the afternoon, and that night he launches the ground invasion. And the ground invasion was really quite horrible. The consequences of Operation Protective Edge, even though they're largely forgotten now, Operation Cast Lead stands out much more. If you make the simple comparisons, in Operation Cast Lead, 350 children were killed. Operation Protective Edge, about 550 children were killed. Operation Cast Lead, 6,300 homes were flattened, pulverized. Operation Protective Edge was 18,000. So everything that we remember from Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, it was sometimes in the order of 100, 200% worse during Protective Edge. Protective Edge was a genuine nightmare. What happened there? I'll tell you,
You call it a massacre in the book.
It's much worse actually than a massacre, I think, because I remember, just to tell you my own skepticism, when Operation Protective Edge began, there was one of the spokespersons from one of the human rights organizations in Gaza, can't remember now his name. He said, I think it was on Democracy Now! He was interviewed, and he said, what's happening now makes Operation Cast Lead like a party. I thought, no, that can't really be. But in fact, it was. It was very striking to me that the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, I think he was the head of the ICRC, he toured Gaza after Protective Edge, and he's accustomed to war zones. He's accustomed to war zones. He said he'd never seen the level of destruction inflicted on a place as what was inflicted on Gaza during those 51 days. And then you take the comparison, because comparisons are meaningful. Israel, how many children were killed? 1.
It's 2014.
Yes, it was 550 to 1.
550 Palestinian children to 1.
1. And that one, just by coincidence, was killed in the last hour of the 51 days. Homes destroyed. Gaza, 18,000. Israel, 1.
The counter-argument to that will be that even if, say, I accept Finkelstein's argument that Israel sparked these conflicts, Israel wanted to provoke Hamas, it was still Hamas's choice to fire rockets, knowing the consequences. And this gets to the issue of Hamas's tactical decisions and also their rights as an occupied group to use violence. And that's something you touch on in the book, and we're going to get to in part 2 of this conversation. My guest is Norman Finkelstein. The book is Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. Join us in part 2.